Hey everyone, before we dive into some of the most backwards engine designs ever bolted into cars, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out on automotive content that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about car engineering. All right, let's get into it. Picture this. It's the early 2000s and everyone's making sophisticated engines with advanced technology. But then there's Chrysler, still pushing the 2.4-liter naturally aspirated four-cylinder in their mid-size sedans. This thing made less power than competitors from a decade earlier. While Honda and Toyota were extracting serious horsepower from smaller displacement engines, Chrysler was out here acting like variable valve timing was some kind of witchcraft. The engine was rough, inefficient, and it felt like it belonged in a time capsule from 1995. When your engine makes owners nostalgic for carburetors, you know something went wrong. Then we've got the Mitsubishi Mirage and its three-cylinder engine that launched in 2014. Now, three-cylinder engines can be great when done right, but this wasn't done right. This was done cheaply. 74 horsepower from a 1.2-liter engine in an era when tiny turbocharged three-cylinders were making twice that. The thing buzzed like an angry beehive and had all the refinement of a blender full of rocks. Ford was putting out their 1-liter EcoBoost, making over 100 horsepower. And Mitsubishi showed up with this prehistoric power plant that struggled to merge onto highways. But the Chevrolet Avio's 1.6-liter four-cylinder deserves its own special mention. This engine went into production in the mid-2000s and felt like it was engineered during the Carter administration. 103 horsepower when competitors were easily pushing 130 to 140 from similar displacement. No variable valve timing, ancient port fuel injection design, and fuel economy that was somehow worse than engines with 50% more power. It was the automotive equivalent of bringing a flip phone to a smartphone convention. Speaking of being stuck in the past, let's talk about the Dodge Caliber's 2-liter engine. This thing debuted in 2006, the same year the iPhone was being finalized for launch. While the world was going digital, Dodge was out here with an engine that delivered 158 horsepower with the smoothness of a paint mixer. The engine had been around in various forms since the 90s, and it showed. Every single day, Toyota's 2-liter engines from the same era were making similar power, but actually felt like they belonged in modern vehicles. The Smart Forte Woo and its tiny 3-cylinder engine is next on our list. Now, you'd think a car designed specifically for city use in the 2000s would have a peppy little modern engine. Wrong. The first-generation smart car had a turbocharged 3-cylinder that made 61 horsepower and was mated to an automated manual transmission that shifted like it was thinking really hard about each gear change. By the time the second generation rolled around with 70 horsepower, other manufacturers had lapped them twice in terms of technology. It was years behind the moment it launched. Suzuki really thought they were doing something with the Forenza's 2-liter engine in the mid-2000s. 126 horsepower from 2 liters, when Honda was getting 160 from the same displacement. This Daewoo-derived engine was basically Korean engineering from the 90s rebadged and sold as new. It had the power delivery of an asthmatic lawnmower and about as much refinement. The thing felt agricultural in the worst possible way, like someone looked at modern engine technology and said, "No thanks, we'll stick with what worked in 1993. The Pontiac Aztek's 3.4-liter V6 needs to be discussed. Yes, we all know the Aztek was ugly, but that engine was even worse than the styling. This pushrod V6 made 185 horsepower in 2001 from 3.4 liters. Meanwhile, Honda's 3.2-liter V6 from the same year made 260. Pushrods aren't inherently bad, but this particular engine was a dinosaur even by pushrod standards. It was rough, thirsty, and felt like it was working twice as hard to deliver half the performance. Let's jump over to the Chrysler Sebring and its 2.7-liter V6. This engine became infamous for sludge problems, but even when it wasn't destroying itself, it was woefully behind the times. Making 200 horsepower from 2.7 liters in the mid-2000s sounds okay until you realize the engine was designed in the 90s and barely updated. Honda's V6s were running circles around it in every metric: power, efficiency, refinement, reliability. This engine was like that one guy at the party still talking about his high school glory days while everyone else has moved on with their lives. The Jeep Compass launched in 2007 with a 2-liter four-cylinder, making 158 horsepower. The same year, Volkswagen's 2-liter Turbo 4 was making 200. Mazda's 2.3-liter, naturally aspirated engine was making more power with better fuel economy. But Jeep said, nah, let's use this engine that feels like it was designed when people still used dial-up internet. The power plant was noisy, slow, and drank fuel like it was trying to prove that small engines could be just as inefficient as big ones. Saturn really went out with a whimper, and their engines proved it. The Vue's 2.4-liter four-cylinder from the late 2000s made 169 horsepower. Not terrible on paper, but the execution was purely 2003 technology in a 2008 body. This engine lacked direct injection, had basic variable valve timing at best, and felt coarse compared to what Honda, Toyota, and even Ford were doing at the time. It was the mechanical equivalent of submitting a book report written in crayon when everyone else brought PowerPoint presentations. The Nissan Versa's 1.6-liter four-cylinder is a masterclass in doing the absolute bare minimum. This engine launched in North America in 2007 with 107 horsepower. Ford's 1.6-liter from the same era made 120. The Honda's Fit had a smaller 1.5-liter making more power. Nissan's engine felt like it was designed by accountants whose only goal was to hit the lowest possible price point. No refinement, no power, no sophistication, just the automotive equivalent of plain oatmeal. The Kia Rio's 1.6-liter engine from the early 2000s deserves recognition for being aggressively mediocre. 104 horsepower, when competitors were pushing 120 to 130 from similar or smaller engines. This power plant had all the technical sophistication of a 1990s economy car because that's essentially what it was. Kia would eventually get their act together, but this engine represented everything wrong with budget car manufacturing. It proved you could make an engine that was simultaneously overworked and underpowered. Volkswagen usually gets praised for their engines, but the 2.0 naturally aspirated four-cylinder was a different story. This engine soldiered on in various VW and Audi products well into the 2000s, making around 115 horse-airs. While this was happening, Volkswagen's own turbo engines were making vastly more power from the same or less displacement. This naturally aspirated version felt like a compliance engine, something they had to offer but put zero effort into developing. It was the automotive equivalent of the vegetable you're forced to eat before getting dessert. As the Hyundai Accent's 1.6-liter engine from the late 2000s and early 2010s felt like Hyundai forgot they were supposed to be improving. 110 horsepower when the company's own newer engines were making significantly more. This motor felt rough, sounded terrible under acceleration, and delivered fuel economy that made you wonder if there was a hole in the tank. For a company that was rapidly improving in every other area, this engine was the awkward relative they kept inviting to family gatherings out of obligation. Mazda's 2.3-liter four-cylinder in the Mazda 6 from the early to mid-2000s wasn't terrible, but it was definitely behind the curve, and 160 horsepower. When Honda's Accord had over 200 from a smaller V6 and Toyota's four-cylinder options were more refined. This engine was fine if you set your expectations to the year 2000 and never updated them. It did the job the same way a flip phone does the job of making calls. Technically functional, but you know better options exist. The Subaru Impreza's 2.5-liter naturally aspirated flat 4 has been basically the same engine for what feels like decades. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, it was making around 170 horsepower from 2.5 liters. Meanwhile, smaller turbocharged 4s were making over 200 horsepower easily. Yes, Subaru had the turbo models, but the base engine felt like it was grandfathered in from a previous era. It was reliable, but about as modern as a tube television. Let's talk about the Chevrolet HHR's 2.2-liter four-cylinder. This engine debuted in 2006, making 149 horsepower. Sounds okay until you drive literally any competitor and realize how far behind GM was. The engine was based on the Ecotec family, which had potential, but this particular version felt like it was assembled from leftover parts. It was coarse, not particularly efficient, and lacked the refinement that Japanese competitors had mastered a decade earlier. Chevy was bringing a knife to a gunfight, and the knife was dull. The Nissan Sentra's 2-liter engine from the mid-2010s is proof that being recent doesn't mean being modern. An 130 horsepower from 2 liters in 2013 when turbocharged engines were becoming mainstream and naturally aspirated engines from competitors made more power. This engine felt like Nissan engineers were specifically told to make something that wouldn't offend anyone but also wouldn't impress anyone. Mission accomplished. It was the beige of engines, the plain yogurt of power plants. Ford's 2.3-liter four-cylinder in the early 2000 Ranger was a holdover from the Pinto era. Yes, the Pinto. This engine was making around 143 horsepower in the 2000s from 2.3 liters. For context, sport bikes were making that kind of power from under 1 liter. The engine was reliable, sure, but it was also older than most of the people buying Rangers. A Ford kept it around because it was cheap to produce, not because it was good. It was the mechanical equivalent of reheating leftovers for the 4th day in a row. Finally, we have the Chrysler PT Cruiser's 2.4-liter four-cylinder. This engine made 150 horsepower in the early 2000s and felt every bit as outdated as it was. While Honda was perfecting VTEC and Toyota was making reliable, powerful engines seem easy, Chrysler was churning out this rough, inefficient four-cylinder that belonged in a previous decade. The PT Cruiser was retro-styled on the outside and retro-engineered on the inside, except the retro-engineering wasn't intentional or charming. It was just old technology pretending to be adequate. So there you have it. 20 engine designs that were so far behind the times, they might as well have been vintage before they even left the factory. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane of automotive mediocrity, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me which engine you think was the worst offender. And seriously, if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button so you don't miss more content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Now, you might be wondering why manufacturers kept pushing these engines year after year when they clearly weren't competitive. The answer is actually pretty straightforward, and it comes down to economics and corporate decision-making that prioritizes cost-cutting over innovation. When you're designing a car for a specific price point, every single dollar matters. Developing a new engine from scratch costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Testing it, refining it, certifying it for emission standards across multiple markets, all of that adds up quickly. So when a company already has an old engine that works, meets regulations, and requires minimal tooling investment, the temptation to just keep using it becomes overwhelming. The accountants in the room always seem to win those arguments. But here's the thing that really gets me about all of this. The technology existed. It was available. Smaller companies were doing it. Honda, Toyota, Mazda, they were all proving that you could make efficient, powerful, refined engines at reasonable cost. So these backwards designs weren't the result of technological limitations or impossibly difficult engineering challenges. They were the result of companies deciding that good enough was good enough, that their customers wouldn't know the difference, or that they simply didn't care. That's the most frustrating part of this entire story. It wasn't incompetence so much as apathy masquerading as practicality. What's interesting is that these terrible engines actually hurt the brands that made them. When you get behind the wheel of one of these cars and realize it's underpowered, rough, inefficient, and clearly behind the times, you don't just think that specific engine is bad. You start to wonder about the entire company. You question their engineering department. You doubt their commitment to quality. You're less likely to buy their next product. So by saving money on engine development, these companies were actually losing money in the long run through lost sales and damaged reputations. It's a fascinating case study in short-term thinking, destroying long-term value. The automotive industry has thankfully learned some of these lessons, though not always willingly. The shift toward turbocharging smaller displacement engines, direct injection, variable valve timing, and cylinder deactivation all became industry standard because companies finally realized that customers cared about efficiency and performance. Competition from Tesla forced everyone to think differently about electric powertrains. Stricter emissions regulations around the world made it impossible to keep using ancient engine designs. The manufacturers that resisted these changes the longest, The ones that tried to milk old platforms for an extra decade. They're the ones struggling the most today. What's wild is that some of these engines are still out there on the road. There are probably thousands of Dodge Calibers still being driven, Saturn Views sitting in driveways, Nissan Versas getting their owners through daily commutes. These cars are probably reliable enough, they probably get their owners where they need to go, but I guarantee the owners don't feel like they're driving something cutting edge. They probably feel like they're driving something that was already outdated when they bought it. And that's a shame because cars should be exciting, or at the very least, they should feel modern and capable. The silver lining to all of this is that we're living in a time where automotive engineering is moving faster than ever. Companies are spending billions on electric vehicles, autonomous driving technology, advanced battery systems, and software platforms. The engines we'll be driving in 10 years will be unrecognizable compared to today. And hopefully manufacturers have learned that cutting corners on fundamental engineering isn't a viable long-term strategy. The companies that treat their powertrains seriously, whether they're internal combustion, hybrid, or electric, are the ones winning market share and customer loyalty. If you're thinking about buying a used car from that weird era when we had all these backwards engines, my advice is to test drive as many options as possible. Feel how an old Honda engine compares to an old Chrysler engine. Notice the smoothness, the responsiveness, the way it sounds. You'll immediately understand why some of these cars became classics, while others became jokes. Engineering decisions made decades ago still affect the driving experience today. That's the power of getting it right, and conversely, the pain of getting it wrong. This whole exploration really highlights something important about consumer choice and market forces. When you vote with your wallet, when you choose the better engineered car over the cheaper option, you're telling manufacturers that quality matters. You're voting for companies that invest in research and development. You're saying that a few extra dollars upfront for better engineering is worth it for the years of ownership that follow. Those individual choices add up, and they do influence what gets built next. So, thanks again for hanging out with me while we took this journey through some genuinely terrible engine designs. It's been fun to talk about all these technological dinosaurs that somehow made it into production vehicles. Hopefully you learned something, or at least had a good laugh at the automotive industry's expense. If you found this entertaining or educational, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who's passionate about cars. Comment below with your own experiences driving any of these vehicles. Did you own one of these cars? Do you have strong opinions about which engine was the absolute worst? I'd love to hear about it in the comments section. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, seriously, what are you waiting for? We talk about everything from engine engineering to automotive history to the weirdest cars ever made. New videos drop regularly, and you don't want to miss any of it. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you get notifications every time we upload something new. It truly does help the channel grow, and it makes a real difference in the algorithm. Your support keeps us making content like this, so thank you for that. Until next time, keep questioning automotive mediocrity and demanding better from the manufacturers you support.